CCO. Each artwork in this video is a Procreate painting made with only one brush. This helps to study digital painting and learn how to best use each brush in your arsenal. These are all brushes I already have liked before, and I wanted to learn more about them. I can also learn what I'd consider to be worth modifying about each brush. If I do modify a brush, I make sure to duplicate it first. This first painting is done entirely with a brush called the Ultimate Brush, which is one that I downloaded a long time ago. You can go to folio.procreate.art under Resources to find free brushes and various other things. It might be hard to find specific things, but when you do, you can sometimes find amazing brushes and other resources, so it's really worth your time. This initial artwork is meant to evoke various emotions. I painted it with the Ultimate Brush as well to evoke the feelings of joyful summer exploration and the feeling of traveling through a woodland that's actually very happy and welcoming and helps you to learn to explore the world. It also is supposed to evoke the emotions of joy one has when exploring a new area. When working like this, I advise using as few layers as reasonable, but don't worry about using layers if it would help you out, such as using a different layer for the background and foreground elements. The next one I'm working on here is the Creamy Pastel Round, which is another brush I downloaded a long time ago. I'm using a color palette I created from a dune that I took a photo of in a book. And then I created it into a color palette using Procreate 5x's new auto color palette creation tools. I also strayed from the palette as I wanted to in order to get colors I liked better for the artwork I was creating. This brush has a little bit of texture but is soft. For this next quick painting, I tried out the Oriental brush, which is a little tricky to work with, honestly, and can't go quite as small as I'd like it to. I'd already previously created a smaller version of the brush so that I can get a little more finer detail. However, it creates very pleasing soft effects and it would be excellent to use for feathers and fur. You can also make it very large and get soft effects. I also used the selection tools, eraser tool, multiple layers, and Gaussian blur along with this brush. I used a color palette that I created using a photo of a hawk at sunset to help me gather the colors correctly. I also used a multiply layer to help darken the wood underneath the claws, and I used selection and eraser tool to help sharpen the claws because I couldn't get the sharp effects quite as well. I also did this for the tip of the beak because, as I said, the Oriental brush wasn't quite working right to get these effects. I don't advise you permanently go for the only one brush method for paintings, but it is a really good way of learning how to use and get the best out of the brushes you have, as well as determining what the weaknesses are, so how you'd like to modify them. I used a new layer to get these outline and darker details in the feathers, so that if I messed up, I could either clear the whole layer or make corrections just on these effects without affecting the entire painting underneath. I also go in and get lots of different details in here. I really like the juxtaposition in this painting between the blurriness of the background and the sharpness of the figure. The white glowiness of the outline that shows the sunlight shining through is very pleasant. It's a fantasy species I made up using several references. The old damp brush really does feel like a damp oil paint brush. The way it reacts on the digital canvas requires you to actually layer up the digital paint in a way that's very reminiscent of traditional work. The old damp brush is the original damp brush that I had on the original version of Procreate when I got my iPad in early 2018. When it did an upgrade at one point, I was able to go onto the Procreate forums that I mentioned before and get the old version of the damp brush back on, which I've saved since then. This is that same old damp brush, which I like to use, and it paints in a certain way that's very pleasant. It's more work, but throughout the process of this painting, I'm able to layer it up and get that look of real traditional painting that's been layered, so that the painting underneath shines through the layers above quite well. It makes it a very pleasant brush, but it takes a little longer to get these effects. I'm really happy with this artwork, which was inspired by a photograph of Adam Lambert, but I used several other references to help me work this out. I made an original elf character. He's meant to be male, but I find him particularly androgynous, so nearer to the end I'm actually going to shrink his eye, despite loving large eye styles. I also think his eye is slightly in the wrong position here, so I will end up correcting that. I also did several corrections on the hand. The background layer behind is on a separate layer. I didn't use too many layers for this, but I still used them to help me out quite a bit. I advise You look at several references in order to help you make a more original artwork, but in order to help you understand the way lighting works. I make several corrections here to get the hand anatomy more the way I would like it to by using the selection and transform tools. You can then paint back in around to get everything back connected and to fix your problems. Sometimes I advise doing a layer underneath to fill in a solid color when you're making these transform selections and then merge down. I advise you merge layers down as needed in order to have the program run faster. When you're doing different lighting effects, really look at which surfaces or areas of a body or form or object face towards the light and will be hit by the light. This is very important. It's very important to remember that the main thing you're painting, most of the time, is the light itself, the light hitting the objects. Sometimes I do abstract painterly effects here, such as in the background. I'm enjoying the way the softish texture of the brush works. I'm making sure to get the rim lighting around the edging because the brightest light's actually behind him. However, a secondary bright light source is about to appear, the magical glow in his hand, which I did on a layer on top. I also do the reflected light on this layer, which I'm making sure to hit all the surfaces that would be touched by the glow from the magic light. This adds more three-dimensional form to things and defines the edges. Make sure to use the logic of the situation. Which surfaces face towards in three-dimensional space. Here I'm making the eyes smaller and moving the position, then painting in back around. The last few final touch-ups. Here's the painting. I'm pretty happy with it. I hope you enjoyed it. One of my favorite brushes I ever downloaded is Oil Painty Wet. Now I've created a very wet version using the new modified wet mix tools in Procreate 5X. I really wanted to do a classic sword and sorcery painting as well, so I decided this brush would be ideal to do as a one brush challenge for this exact painting. I made sure to challenge myself to do a more muscular figure, maybe to even draw them from behind, as I normally draw people more facing towards the camera, and to put in a creature that wouldn't have been around with humans necessarily, and I went with a pteranodon. I'm going to make more corrections. This hand is horrible. It's terrible. The thumb's on the wrong side, the fingers are messed up. So I got good reference and fixed the hand. By working on separate layers, having the background, midground, and foreground be on separate layers, the pteranodon on the same layer as the ground, and the man on a layer in front of that with the sky behind it, behind all that, I was able to more easily get this artwork done. I also used the selection tool, eraser tool, and transform tools to help correct things alongside only using one brush. I can also use blur, smudge, and Gaussian blur for things and effects. The other thing I did with this painting is to create a color palette using a real sword and sorcery painting and Procreate 5X's auto color generating palette tool. I also chose my own colors to add on to this. Some of the blues and purple colors that I added in were something I just picked off the color wheel. I gathered many sword and sorcery inspiring references in a VisRef file before I actually started this painting, and I looked at these references on the side while I painted. I used the split screen functionality of my 12.9-inch iPad. I made a smallest section the reference, which I stacked up in a row so I could see them all, although everything was much smaller as I used the priority of the screen for the actual painting. I also zoomed out more for more of this work, zooming in only as needed. Between the pterodactyl and ground layer and the sky layer, I added these spiky mountains. I used the selection tool and color fill to help me with that. I realized the pteranodon wasn't very accurate. Now I made the man vanish by turning the layer's visibility off. Before coming back to the painting to paint the pteranodon like I am here, I went and gathered reference of pteranodons, various skeletal and paleoart reconstructions. In a separate VisRef file, I created a pteranodon reference file, which I looked at to help me paint the pteranodon. I went back and forth between that reference and the sword and sorcery reference so I could look at my lighting and also the creature's anatomy to help me decide how I was painting it. I focused more on the art style than 100% paleo accuracy because, as we know, this painting is a fantasy work on an alien planet of some sort, not an actual scene depicted from real-world history. I decided my muscular barbarian man needed to have very long hair, because I love very, very long hair. Trying to make sure to capture the style and the feeling of the art more than anything else, but I was really challenging myself to also have good anatomy, composition, and overall design. Sometimes I zoomed in to get details like hair details and shading. I also used the selection tool to select areas in order to make them paler. To make these mountains more misty and blended with the sky, I simply lowered the opacity of the entire layer. On a layer on top, with normal opacity, I added some of the highlights on the rocky crags. I ended up going back to the full background layer to add in bright red clouds using a different color on the color palette. Here I brighten up the skin using an overlay layer, which is good for brightening skin, to have everything in the lighting seem more glowing, for the skin to feel even more alive. I also add a lot of brighter highlights on the brass details. I created a brass color palette using the auto palette generation tools by getting photos of actual brass and creating a photo mashed, stretched out photo I could work from to create the color palette. Sometimes I also just use the color dropper or my own best guess on the color wheel. I'm adding many touch-ups here. I also added a multiply layer to darken some of the shadows over things like his entire back. As you can see, I'm adding details all around, such as highlights on these rocks in the midground and on the ground, because there were no details on those near things. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.